Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod.
So we're walking around the home improvement stores, you're opening up the advertisements in the mail, and you can't escape it. The whole world is preparing for the next holiday, weeks in advance. And in reaction to that, all of our holiday memories and misadventures start to spin up. So today's episode is dedicated to holiday madness.
Joseph.
I think the Christmas decorations go up right after Labor Day, together with all the pumpkins and corn stalks and the turkey images. And I've had people talk already in September, right after Labor Day, kids are going back to school, and then the holidays are coming.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely happens in the consulting room. People begin to kind of fret about where they're going to go, whose family they're going to be with this year. They start to actually kind of dread it often.
And the power of the holiday, whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or any number of things, the holiday is landing like a UFO like on top of your roof, the War of the Worlds, and you cannot escape it. And really, we have to deal with it. We have to find a way to acknowledge what the heck is going on during holidays, particularly when families come together, that just so affects us. And is there any way we can vaccinate ourselves against the holiday madness?
Or use it. Use what happens, psychologically.
I really like your image of the UFO. The holiday UFO is hovering, and then it comes down to Earth. And then what happens? We're abducted.
Yes, we are.
By the archetypal alien spirit of childhood, usually.
Yeah, we get pulled back into these family complexes.
And so translating that into purely Jungian language, something in the psychological landscape activates, and we call that a complex. So there are lots of different complexes which are organized around memories. And when the whole family gets together with all of these high, intense expectations, the memories around those events are intensely infused with feeling.
Right. And it's like a feeling tape that plays. So if you always felt like the outsider as a child, maybe you don't feel that way in your adult life. But when you are back in the family, often it's like, the play button gets hit and you're back in this old feeling. And it kind of limits your options about how you relate to the situation. So you find yourself behaving in ways that you don't normally behave when you're not in that situation in that activated complex.
Holidays are regressive. And that inner 8-year-old or 14-year-old is right there hoping once again that this year, Mom won't cook that horrible dish that he always hates, and he's asked her so many times to please not make that green bean dish with the mushroom soup in it, or whatever it is that activates a wish, a protest, something that you wish would be different, and something that would heal an old wound. That this time, it's going to come out differently.
Yeah, there's this expectation.
Relentless hope that somehow this time, whether it's symbolized by a dish you want or a dish that you don't want, something will happen to change this old complex.
So holidays are a time that we're reminded of unmet needs. We're reminded of how we didn't feel held, or that some expectation was never met, or that our family, was wounded in many ways. That comes up for us.
And so it is the hope that gets rekindled, and also the disappointment that one holiday and changing something over the holiday is going to somehow heal the past, make a repair of some sort.
So what you're saying is there are things that we project onto the holiday.
Aha.
Well, that we project, and that also the culture pressures us into believing. So we're watching television, let's say, and there are all these very idealized images of what Thanksgiving should look like or what Christmas should look like, which are really some kind of media idealization of it. But we've been watching them for 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 or 70 years. And then we go home, and of course, it's nothing like that. So we do have expectations about what would happen in that highly limited environment, and particularly if we're adults and we're going home for a holiday and the whole family is reconvening. Even if there was some kind of a developmental repair that was required, it's not going to happen in 4 hours. So we're really, our psyches kind of set us up in terms of our expectations and also remembering wounds, old wounds.
Psyche sets us up. It is a kind of archetypal field. When I think about Thanksgiving and pilgrims and mythology and all of the rest of it, the archetype of the harvest.
Right.
And
harvest.
then we've got Christmas, which is solstice. That these things are carriers for a lot of intensities. And we have the advertisers who really hype it up. And even if we kind of consciously know better, quote unquote, something still gets activated that goes back millennia.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking with your reference to the sort of archetypal underpinnings of these holidays, I'm thinking about the way that, for example, in Rome, if you go into a 15th century church or something, there's usually a Roman temple underneath, there's this sort of excavation of these traditions, so you can look at Christmas or Hanukkah. And of course, we all know that it has these sort of pagan roots, but if you really go back, you can see that, for example, Christmas has these very, very deep roots into this kind of profoundly archetypal experience of turning back toward the light and the rebirth of the sun. And the iconography of Christmas, actually, for example, is really tied to that in ways that we don't even really appreciate. But for example, the flying reindeer. I mean, the indigenous people of, I think it's Finland, worshipped the female deer. It was the female deer who kept her horns over the winter. And they saw her as a kind of mother goddess who would carry the sun across the sky in her horns. So it's like embedded in a way that's not conscious. But I think just on a kind of psychic level that we tap into this sense that there's something really, really big going on here. And yet we're alienated from that deeper meaning, partly because of the layers of history in between, but also the commercialization. So there is this sense that some of our expectations around holidays, and it's of course not just Christmas, we could look at the vernal holidays around, Easter or Passover or Halloween, of course. And I mean, there's really ancient antecedents to all of these. It's like something in our psyche knows that they're marking something big that's in tune with the rhythms of nature.
So on that level, as we're entering into something which could seem as common as a holiday meal, let's say, and on a conscious level, we're worried about what to wear or what gift we're going to bring to dinner and whether or not we like ham or turkey, that at a whole other level of the psyche, there is this kind of rumbling around the deep archetypal mytho-poetic themes and images that are activating and perhaps even trying to find a way of surfacing, which often do not.
And that can leave us feeling really hollow.
Yes, that something that should have been deeply meaningful didn't hit the mark, didn't happen. And then there are all kinds of ways in which people might clumsily try to bring a sense of what awe or the miraculous to a holiday.
The archetypal, the numinous, right? By buying too many presents, for example. And then the Christmas tree looks numinous because there's 50 wrapped presents underneath it. That doesn't really hit the mark.
Yeah, that this time will be different. This time something magical will happen. something healing will happen. The magical, archetypal, numinous it will happen. And I will have that special, special holiday glow, the special feeling. But in, a family that has the same cast of characters from year to year, there's the idealization here. And then there is the cast of characters that is pretty much same old, same old.
And particularly same old when they come together. So there's a way in which when we go home for, let's say, Christmas, even though we might be leading a very sophisticated lives day to day, have very erudite conversations that we're aesthetes out in the world. And then when all of a sudden all 5 of the family members are together, and mom gives you that little raised eye look, you're finding yourself, resentfully mowing the lawn, and cursing yourself under your breath for being forced into doing something you would never normally do, and submitting once again to some kind of parental authority, and you're a resentful teenage boy. That's not my story, by the way.
Of course not. Of course
I don't
not.
know where that came from.
But, it's sometimes I like to think of it, and I've had this experience, and I know people I've worked with have had this experience, that when you go back into the family situation, it feels as if someone has cast a spell. There's this fairy tale that it's a Grimm's tale, Jorinda and Joringel, and they're a couple, they're going to get married, and the exhortation at the beginning of the tale is, do not find yourself within something like 50 paces of the witch's castle at sundown. Because if you're within that ring, that's it, and of course they do, and it goes on from there. But it's almost like that. It's like, you're fine, you're in your adult persona, you're competent, you're whatever, you're individuated, but then you get within 50 paces of the family home and all the brothers and sisters are there, and it's like, oh, I'm under the witch's spell, and I'm back to being 14 and feeling resentful or incompetent or whatever the family role is that you've been assigned. And so we find ourselves playing out these old roles.
And the old roles can be painful, but they can also be very pleasurable. I mean, I've talked to clients who go to their husband's family for a holiday, and all of a sudden the husband is kind of, sitting at the kitchen table looking at their mom while she's manually inserting a fresh baked biscuit in his mouth, and he's chewing it. And she's like, oh my God, my husband's like a powerful attorney. Like, when the hell did this happen? And it's like shocking to see that her husband would behave that way. Yeah. And he's actually just thrilled to be, mommy's golden boy again.
So there are some really positive aspects to regression.
Well, pleasurable. I don't know if I would call it positive.
Okay,
but it's definitely pleasurable to go back to a golden
Sometimes,
time.
Right.
That's right. But there's another side of it. And being in an observing role to the holiday madness can be shocking sometimes.
If you've ever been to somebody else's house, maybe in college or somewhere where you were far afield, and some colleague or fellow student, whatever, invites you home, says, come on to my house for Thanksgiving or spend Christmas with us. You really can see family dynamics because you're not part of that family field. You have not been enculturated, conditioned, et cetera, and you can see some of these things and go, oh my goodness. Is that what they do here?
Well, Joseph, you brought up a good point when we were sort of working this up before we hit record, is the tendency for all of us, I think, when we are in a kind of holiday situation to drink and eat too much as a way of quelling anxiety. And, you were saying, like, what would it be like to not drink at all?
And that's perhaps one way of resisting the spell.
Yeah.
It's to really make a decision to be stone cold sober for an entire holiday visit, and to really just quietly observe the hijinks of what's going on.
Because when you're abducted by the fairies or the people in the UFO, one of the rules was always not to eat or drink in the magical land, or you would be held captive. So if you don't,
such a good point. Yeah.
If you don't drink and you don't alter your state of consciousness,
then you can retain
you can
consciousness.
retain exactly your own perspective. Maybe see it both ways of this is the family dynamic and it's okay, or you could let it play out. And I also see it from my adult perspective.
Sometimes when I have a client who's about to go into kind of a difficult family situation, the recommendation I give is be an anthropologist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's exactly kind of what I'm sort of inviting them to do, is see if you can stand outside the old role and just observe and collect information and be curious. By the way, I'm thinking maybe some of our listeners are going to try to go through the holiday stone cold sober, but others of us, maybe not so much.
2 bottles of wine and a whole fruitcake later, I'm ready to unwrap presents.
I used to do that. I would actually go as an anthropologist into sort of corporate social situations. And my husband worked for big companies, and I was always very ill at ease. And I would pretend that I was Margaret Mead.
Would you really?
Yes, I really would. And that my job was to learn as much about the Samoans with as much goodwill as I could possibly muster, but to extend myself to the Samoans and see what I could learn about their traditions and beliefs and all the rest of it. And I have to tell you, it really helped because I felt like I had a mission and a role and a disguise that no one knew that I was Margaret.
And it shifts the frame, doesn't it? It's not about whether or not you perform well. You're not anticipating this sort of failure. You're just there to be curious.
And not drinking, for example, as you guys have suggested, is another way to shift the frame and to retain an observing ego.
Right.
I can be part of, a participant observer, and still look at it with some objectivity and not just get swept away.
So that ability to be alert enough to set an intention, to be in an environment that's provocative with intentionality, kind of stimulates something in the brain, simulates something in the psyche, which is different from the sleepiness that we feel when we're getting drawn into a familiar environment and then consequently sucked into a role. And the idea of the family role can happen in terms of the role you played in your family and or the roles that you cast other members in the family. And, and some of those things are well written about, but, who's the black sheep in the family? And no matter how well they've done or how redeemed their lives have become, when the family comes together, they're the identified patient. They're the problem child, which is exhausting and demoralizing and deeply kind of painful, and also not really anyone's fault in a sense, because there's a whole field of thousands of memories that are battering against people's nervous systems and their minds, kind of compelling them back into this drift of old patterns.
The spell. That's the spell.
So there's another little fairy tale image for that idea of the spell. It's a little different, but this is a theme that turns up a lot in fairy tales, but the little piece I have here is from the Singing Springing Lark, where it's kind of a Beauty and the Beast thing. And he's going to go back to her house with her to meet her family, but there can be no light that hits him. Otherwise, he'll be turned into lark and fly away. And, she just gets a little careless. It's that moment in fairy tales when you just slip, you just forget something, and you become under the influence of the family complex, and you just regress into some less conscious state.
And when we're less conscious, then complexes, archetypes, and shadow particularly come forward. And shadow is kind of all the often antisocial impulses that, we keep at bay, that we've been able to kind of calm down and put to the side so that we can live pleasant, proud, conscious lives. And since one of the things that often comes out is teasing behavior and often merciless teasing behavior, which somebody would be horrified if they saw a little video of themselves doing it. But somehow in the family structure, that just comes back in gangbusters.
So there's a lot of kind of underground aggression that can come out of these things.
Hostility.
Yeah.
Which is also part of being a child, by the way. I mean, learning how to cord in one's aggression is part of maturing as a child. But going back into the pit, and all of a sudden, there's a lot of hash slinging that can show up in a way that makes people very ambivalent about wanting to return. Wanting to go home again.
You know, I'm thinking about our title for today, which is Holiday Madness. And what's coming up in me is how much I'm looking forward to having all of my family for Thanksgiving. Mm-hmm. And we are kind of, there is a madness in a way. It's a happy madness. Certain people can lock horns, but there's also something to be said for just being together, and that people do come together, and that the expectation, at least on my part, is not that everything is going to be sugar and spice and everything nice, but we are a family and we are going to hang out together. And we are going to have turkey.
Yeah. And, you're raising a good point that the expectation shouldn't be that it's perfect, and that there's a way that being in our families, we're going to step on each other's toes or get back into old patterns or something. And there can be something about these rituals of connection that can sort of lance these interpersonal boils. You know, it's like there was some friction between two family members and maybe it heats up over Thanksgiving dinner, but the air got cleared or something.
That it's depotentiated in a way, that two
Hopefully.
people can get into a verbal sparring match of some sort. And it's just part of it, part of being imperfect, part of whatever else you want to chalk it up to. But it doesn't take on the kind of, really heavy, ominous, destructive overtones or undertones of some of what we've been talking about. It's just two people being two people, and it's part of a larger whole. So it's relativized. It's not the big archetypal deal anymore. It's just us being the people we are, being a family, and managing the whole thing.
But what do you think, and this is an interesting thing clinically, what does it take in our work with clients to support somebody moving from that hot, anguished place about the family complex and or what did or what might happen with the approaching holiday to that much softer place where they can kind of roll with it, be adaptive, and not take it in so fully? How do people do that?
There is a big question. Because that's exactly it, of how to depotentiate it, that, Aunt Agatha and Uncle so-and-so are still going to do the stuff that they do. But how to not have it be quite so intense.
So one of the first things that comes up for me, and it's obviously a big question, is this thing that Jung said. He said, when it starts off, a complex has you. But when you've integrated and worked with that complex more, then you have the complex. So it's not that it's going to go away. It's not that it's not going to continue to bother you, these things that come up in this family, but that you will have a different relationship to it. And you'll have a greater ability to observe. And the thing about observing is you can't observe something when you're right up on it. It requires a sense of distance and kind of separating yourself a little bit to stand apart from. And then you can sort of see what's happening. So how do you get there? I mean, first of all, I think the very first, perhaps, thing that has to happen is some mourning. You have to grieve that your idealized expectations are not going to be met. And you have to mourn the fantasy family, And
I would step back even a little bit before that, because in order to grieve it, one would have to have already integrated a kind of picture about what is or isn't there or what's missing.
Right.
And I would say that for those of you that have a therapist or working with an analyst, for instance, that to give yourself permission to unload your stories, to be able to talk about the charged experiences, let's say from holidays, that in the talking, and not just once, but in the telling and retelling of difficult experiences, that it's a little bit as if we're wringing out a wet dish towel and we're wringing out the level of emotionality around the remembered images. And that happens through talking about it. I remember a moment in my own analysis, and all of us, in order to become a Jungian analyst, you have to be an analytic patient for years in order to be able to do your own work and then hopefully lead people through a process as well. In my own analysis, I came to this moment where I was just about to launch into yet another complaint about my family of origin, and very much on automatic pilot. And all of a sudden, I felt this groan happen inside of me. And I said, I just cannot bear to tell this story one more time. It is so boring. And that was the moment. That
there was enough emotion wrung out of
it that it was just this dry, dusty set of, old events that I was sick and tired of just wasting my time talking about. But I had to get to that moment authentically. I couldn't pretend it was all wrung out. I had to wring it out over and over again. So as a first step, those of you who are working with yourselves, I would suggest that people really journal about, particularly the key disturbing memories that you have about a holiday, journaling it and then going back and filling in more and more details about it, and to really try to wring out every little bit of insight that you can have, and as fully vivid memories around it, which is a kind of private suffering. But what you're doing now in the review of the memory is you're adding a level of self-awareness just because of the age that you are now compared to the age you were when it happened. You're adding a level of self-awareness that begins to break it open and begins slowly to start breaking the spell a little bit, and then opens up to deeper questions like, what was missing? What was I fantasizing underneath all of this? What was I comparing this to that even let me know this was not normal for this nonsense to be happening? So just the story of Christmas in your own family, let's say, could really become an enormous document of self-reflection that really does lead to some ability to feel grounded.
I like the combination. I like the image of the dish towel and wringing out all the feeling, and to journal about it, to write letters to various family members, dear Uncle so-and-so, whenever you do, blah, blah, blah. And I remember, and just put it all down on paper and don't send it. But it's for you, of wringing it all out, combined with setting the intention to maybe be Margaret Mead or some other image of what it's like to observe, and to hold both of those places of your rational adult mind that can set an intention, either not drink or limit the drinking and really look at what's going on. Plus, the feelings are there. What you said, Lisa, about having the complex instead of the complex having you. And that in itself can be a real personal task.
Yeah, and back to Margaret Mead for a second and having a complex. One of the things that can happen when you're in that mind frame is that you can watch yourself get activated. You can watch yourself get upset when the thing happens that always happens. And you can say, oh, there's that thing that happens, and then I feel like this. And that can be a great relief. I mean, it's not that you're not having the reaction, but that you're able to sort of narrate it and observe it. I think it just gives you more options for what to do with it. It's just a different relationship with it.
And it's a different story.
Yeah.
And to be able to see one's own psychology as a kind of living object. So one of the things that I like to tell a new analysand or invite them to think about, it's that their psychology is like a car in front of us, and we're going to both lift the hood and stand side by side and look down at the engine and examine how it's functioning, and then we're going to have a conversation about it. But neither of us thinks we're the car, and neither of us thinks we're the engine, but we're curious about how the car and the engine are running. Mm-hmm. And that ability to talk about our own psychology in the third person, that it is doing this rather than I am doing this, is part of that breathing room. Mm-hmm. Oh, my psyche gets incredibly angry when I see that look on my brother's face.
Right. So you're disidentifying from the complex behavior and emotions.
Mm-hmm. What I like about what we're saying here is you can feel whatever you feel and observe it, that this is something you can think your way through, something you can intend, you can make it different for yourself. This is not the magical mystery tour. So we're giving some suggestions that are actually implementable. We're not saying that something mysterious and strange has to change inside in some unseen way over many, many years. No, you can go into your family over the holidays and actually just do these things. You don't have to do it perfectly.
Yeah.
I am so struck that we've gotten onto this track where we're sort of giving advice, which is not what we usually do in this podcast.
But I guess it seems like the holidays are coming up upon us quickly. There isn't time to look for big transcendental solutions. So we're kind of being very pragmatic about it.
I think that's right. We've gone to the other side here. We're very practical, step by step. Here's a recipe for it. Unlike your Aunt Agatha's recipe for green bean casserole. Here's another recipe.
Since we're on the roll, but a very pragmatic solution that I remember making in my own family is that when I was in my 20s and I had gone into my first round of therapy, I was in all of this kind of personal anthropologic work, digging things out. And I would want to talk to my sisters about it constantly and want to talk to them every time I saw them. And it was very distressing for my sisters. They really did not enjoy going through this. And I became kind of a sore spot for them. So I'm sure I was one of the things that they were not looking forward to at the holidays. And finally, I realized, that I was the only one who was enjoying this archaeologic dig, and that I could actually simply be polite, be just a polite house guest. And as you were talking earlier, Deb, to just be a respectful, polite person, and with all goodwill to be talk to my sisters as if they were colleagues in some fashion.
Again, it's kind of drying it out, isn't it?
The bonfire just burned down.
Yeah.
And I was really the one who was throwing one more log on the fire because I wanted to have a process around it. And that was not really helping anyone.
Yeah.
There's a way in which I think we want a kind of togetherness of, whether it's you on your archaeological dig of let's all sit down together and process our childhood and family dynamics and so on. And your sisters didn't want to do that. It can be around political differences, for example, and those can be pretty heated today. It can be about all kinds of things of whose story is going to hold sway. And how to hold the differences, that there are multiple realities. One person thinks that my mythological Aunt Agatha was really wonderful and funny and dotty and sweet, and somebody else thinks she was just a holy terror, let's say. That there can be multiple realities of one person doesn't want to discuss family dynamics. Another person has this political view. Somebody else has that strongly held opinion. And just respect. If these were colleagues of yours at work, you would just let them have their opinions and resist that tidal pull that we all somehow have to come together in some way where we have one story. We make one meaning out of whatever's going on. No, you're not going to. There are huge differences in families, plus the kinship ties.
And, speaking of sort of the feeling that we all need to come together, some people elect not to join their families for holidays. And that's sort of a different kind of discussion, isn't it?
I made that decision at a certain point in my 30s, and I would go and visit my family in the summers or for a vacation or in some other context, but just deciding that whatever lands in the middle of a holiday, it just doesn't seem to work for anybody. So
right.
Why
so
not?
You could
Why?
make a different choice.
Yeah, let's have fun. Let's
Yeah.
do something else at a different time when we're just not constantly walking over landmines.
You can step out of it as well as step into it.
So as we're talking among ourselves, and the three of us are analysts, so we can kind of use jargon sometimes. Oh, it's a complex. And we'll all look at each other and nod very sagaciously. And because there's a common understanding, but to kind of open it up in a more lived way, that your holidays are alive in you through the narrative, through the stories that you tell about your holidays, whether you tell them to other people or you tell them yourself. And our holidays are full of hilarious stories and painful stories and innocuous stories. And whether it's, mom's frantic need to make 10 trays of lasagna, which nobody will eat, or it's, the sister who makes bizarre, intricate games, which the family is forced to play, or my family would have a huge meal that was so big you could barely kind of walk, and then they'd all start chain smoking and playing poker with the children, which all seemed perfectly normal, when I was 9 years old. I learned to play 5-car stud from my grandfather, Christmas evening, and it would happen every Christmas, and it was just kind of this thing. But our stories are the patina on top of whatever our expectations are about the holidays moving forward. And so they're still alive. And whether they're stories of hijinks or stories of religious intensity.
I have a story that I got to share here with you guys and our listeners of a Christmas where my mother really had an idealized version of Christmas, and she had decided that on one of the days leading up to Christmas, we would have a wonderful family evening. My two parents, and my sister and my little brother. And the good, wonderful thing to do would be to read Dickens' A Christmas Carol by the fire and have some nice hors d'oeuvres and so on. And this
it sounds very cultured.
Very sophisticated.
Doesn't it sound lovely? Well, what neither one of my parents knew was that we had a game as children of a dare game. And this involved getting onto the roof. There was a flat place and a window and dropping an egg down the chimney. And
so you were crawling on the roof.
We're crawling
when no
on
one was
the roof,
looking.
Crawling along, hitching along on the gable. And then you would hold onto the chimney, stand up, and drop an egg down the chimney. And the idea was that the egg would go splat on the bottom of the fireplace, but it never did. Because what we didn't know was the fireplaces have dampers. So we had done this during the warmer weather.
Didn't it smell?
It never smelled. Don't ask me why. No one ever noticed it.
How many eggs did you drop down?
I think
You're
we
being
dropped,
Margaret Mead right now.
we dropped down quite a few. So it was a sort of dare game. And we'd forgotten all about it, of course. So now we have this nice family Christmas, and my father is going to light the fire. So logs are laid.
The book is out. She's ready to read it.
The book is out. Lovely family gathered. And the damper will not open. And he's lit the newspaper and the damper won't open. The smoke is billowing out, and he takes a log and starts bashing on the damper and going, "God damn it, Carolyn! Jesus H. Christ!"
And are all of you sitting there realizing why he can't open the damper at that
My
point?
sister and I look at each other and we know what it is. We know where the eggs went and why they didn't land on the floor of the fireplace.
Merry Christmas, everyone.
My sister says nothing. I say nothing. We are complete innocents. But it was rather the antithesis of a Dickensian evening.
Yes, absolutely. And that story is woven into the fabric of Christmas for now forever.
It's like the shadow will out.
The shadow will out.
Oh, that's a great story.
So, going into these holidays, we know everyone's going to be weaving new stories in. You're going to make the best choices that you can. We hope that you'll remember the archetypal underpinnings of the holidays you're coming in, which actually, by acknowledging that, might allow a certain kind of spiritual spiritual sentiment to finally rise and land in a way that maybe it hadn't before, to be able to watch yourself with objectivity, stay away from the booze.
If you need to.
Don't throw any logs on the family fire and set things ablaze if you don't want it to be ablaze.
Do not light the fire before opening the damper.
Absolutely. And we wish you safe travels wherever you're going.
Okay, and with that, we'll switch to a dream.
Hi, this is Deb from This Jungian Life podcast. Joseph, Lisa, and I have been deeply moved by your response to our work. But producing, editing, and distributing it involves substantial expenses, and now we need your help. Please stop by our website, thisjungianlife.com, and click on the heading, Be Our Patron. You'll be redirected to our Patreon funding page. Patreon helps creators connect with people who believe in projects like ours. There, you can sign up with your credit card to support us for as little as $1 a month. And at higher levels of support, we'll provide special episodes, behind-the-scenes photos and stories, and a chance to join a select pool of listeners for dream interpretations. Once again, please go to thisjungianlife.com and click on Be Our Patron. Thank you.
The dream we have today, as always, sent in by a listener. The dreamer is a 45-year-old woman who is an engineer by training. And here's the dream. I am in a bathhouse, a Turkish bath, and sitting immersed in the pool of warm water to my waist. I am sitting with my back to a rectangle column made out of black granite. I have my arms are stretched like a crucifix, and my hands are holding onto the column that is behind me. The pool is made out of green granite. To my left, there is an altar made out of a cubic-shaped granite, and on which sits a woman who is a sage, a seer or fortune teller, or a magician. She is wearing a long dress and is sitting cross-legged. My back is hot and dries the film of water on the column, and as the column dries, my back leaves marks on the column. The marks are magical symbols. They resemble the Japanese Zen art that is done by a water-wet brush on a black rock, and it fades as water dries. The woman comes and looks at them, and she is flabbergasted. She has never seen magical marks such as these. In the bottom of the pool and in front of me, there is a piece of green granite with a circular metal inlay and a ring attached to the circular metal. It resembles the remains of a counterweight that would have been used in operating the gates to castles. I look at it, and with the power of my mere stare, the rock floats up to the surface of the water and glides on the surface. Then the rock starts skipping on the surface of water 3 times and lands on the skirt of the woman who is back on the altar. Ooh, okay.
It's a lot of archetypal material.
Yeah, okay, so here's what the streamer says. I am a survivor. I'm a trauma survivor of a revolution, war, and political mass murders that drastically impacted my immediate family in a Middle Eastern country. I migrated 20 years ago, and in the past 4 years, I have been in analysis. I am at a point in analysis that I can interpret my own dreams, and I have extensively read books. In the past 5 to 6 months, I've been having frequent and fascinating archetypal dreams of gods, goddesses, and magical beings and places. Okay, and then what were the main feelings in the dream? She says, a pleasant reminder of a Middle Eastern bathhouse, a serene environment, its heat and tranquility. The magical nature of the dream was puzzling.
The first thing I can feel is that it's a very complicated dream, and it would take a lot of work, maybe over even weeks or months, to really unpack and metabolize the various components of it. But if we start at the beginning with the image of a person immersed in a pool of warm water, the first feeling that I have is this relaxing down in consciousness, that abaissement that Jung talked about, that the ego needs to relax down into the fluid of the unconscious to begin to catch glimpses of, the things that are on the move in the deep.
And I'm thinking about the alchemical image of people in the bath and the alchemical process of solutio, where old complexes and so on can dissolve, old ego structures, etc., can kind of melt into the water. The feeling tone seems like it's safe, and a Turkish bath, it's all very acculturated, right? Of people would go to bathhouses and it would be warm water.
Yeah, it seems like this dreamer has sort of specific associations with that from her.
Versus, let's say, being out in the ocean. But here there's a lot of structure, especially a lot of granite.
Yeah, and it's black and green.
Does the black and green kind of speak to you?
I'm just noticing it. I don't have a particular
an immediate association.
No. Yeah. I'm feeling myself moving into the stream kind of slowly. And maybe that's part of that kind of sinking in that you talked about, Joseph.
Well, it's definitely inviting us in. I think about the kind of guided meditations that some people do at workshops. And this almost sounds like something you could induct somebody down into to have a certain kind of encounter. Some of the things I just want to land to is stepping away a little bit from the narrative and just looking at the sequence of some of the images. So we're sinking down in the water. Then she's in a crucifixion position. Then there's a woman sitting on a cube. So I'm thinking a little bit about what does it mean for an Analysand, for any of us, to have a moment of crucifixion, to have the hands, pinned or extended right and left. Her arms are stretched out and she's holding the column. So that's different than being nailed to a cross. There's a decision involved in this. Even if we were to adopt the position right now and we reach out to the right and left, there's this decision to hold a certain amount of tension and to conduct or be a conductor for a tension between two things or several things. So there's some agency in the dreamer's mind, which is reflected perhaps in their comments, the context, that they have been doing work. And they have been very active in this work. The next image of the woman sitting on the cube is an archetypal image from the tarot series, tarot cards, and the High Priestess, which is the second tarot card in the sequence. And often what we'll see are as a female figure sitting on a cube between two pillars, which are thought to be the pillars of Solomon, white and black. And as she sits holding a scroll, which is often a symbol of the Torah and has symbols on it, Hebrew letters, perhaps not unlike the symbols that the woman's back is leaving as the water dries, which are the laws of the universe and also the secret recordings of the unconscious. And one interpretation or several images of the High Priestess has her robe, as it cascades to her feet, turning into water. And it is an idea that the watery substance of the unconscious is an extension of this primal feminine. And she's, having an encounter in the dream with the substance of the unconscious itself.
Yeah, and that's sort of, I think that the themes that you're lifting up there, you can also see that in the fact that these magical symbols apparently of great potency, that the sage is flabbergasted at them. They're left by the dreamer's back. And so this is something that's happening sort of behind us, like outside of consciousness, but there's something really potent there that's moving in the unconscious.
It reminds me also of some of the images that are familiar in Kundalini Yoga, where you'll have an image of the sage, and then coming up the spine of the sage, there will be a Sanskrit words or letters, which are inscribed on the images of the chakras, or these ideas of energy centers, ascending and intricate kind of dialogues.
That's an interesting amplification. Just going back for 1 second to the crucifix, Joseph, which you did a really good job with, and to say that we often understand the image of the crucifix as holding the tension of the opposites. And as you point out, it is done voluntarily. She's not nailed there, but there is a kind of willingness to submit to this betwixt and between place and to hold that.
I'm aware that I feel very hesitant about saying anything much about this dream, given the dreamer's history and all these very magical and it seems to me very promising symbols in the dream. I'm kind of reluctant to deconstruct it in a way or make meaning out of it. I'm interested in the shadow figure of this woman who is the sage, a seer, a fortune teller, or a magician. And what this sage, seer, fortune teller may be a healing kind of compensatory image that the psyche has generated because the dreamer, dream ego, really needs this. And the symbols are in the back, and those water paintings, I've seen them where you have a special board and you can make some kind of a drawing with a wet paintbrush, and as the water evaporates, the image fades. So it may imply that there are some things that are not in consciousness, but maybe are coming into being.
I can understand your caution, Deb, that when somebody brings a dream that is full of very archetypal images, as analysts, we often have a sense that there's a lot of power in the psyche, there's a lot of energy, and that we don't want people to become overwhelmed or as they're managing it.
This, you want to treat it reverently.
Yes, exactly.
So you want to be careful not to manhandle it. And, there's also sometimes, and I don't get the sense this is true of this dreamer, but it's hard to say for sure. Sometimes these big archetypal dreams are kind of a defense. It's sort of a kind of spiritual bypass sort of phenomenon.
Right. So sometimes a person could be really facing a very concrete suffering in their lives, and they'll kind of ascend to a very spiritual or a very philosophic attitude to cope with it for a while. Sometimes that really helps them get through a rough spot. And then at another time in their life, they'll have to re-land on what happened when perhaps it feels safer to really experience the feeling. But I think something that's encouraging, Deb, based on your respect for the dream, is the idea that an enormous counterweight has constellated in the second half of the dream. So she talks about this big metal circle, which is linked into the granite with a ring on it. And if we think about it as a counterweight, just like a counterweighted window. So these old windows were extremely heavy, so they would run a rope from the bottom window up along the sides and down into the casing of the wall. And inside the wall, there would be a very heavy lead weight. So the window would be balanced, and it would just take a little bit of energy to lift the window up when it would normally be too heavy for somebody to move. So here we have a counterweight, which would be used to create some ease in lifting the impossibly heavy castle door. But right now it's floating, so it can't really do its job. It's not supposed to be floating. It's supposed to be as heavy as a castle door. But her magical power in the dream prevents it from actually being as weighty as it would need to be effective. So this goes a little to your idea about whether or not it's difficult at the moment to allow the counterbalancing weightiness to land, but its potential is there.
Yeah, and it skips on the surface. So there may be a way that there is some deep content here that can only skim across the surface of it for now.
And land in the lap of the shadow figure, the woman who's back on the altar. So something needs to be spiritualized, perhaps, for now.
But there is someone to hold it. There is an energy in the psyche that can hold it.
Yes.
The other thing that is floating through the dream very lightly at the moment, between the image of the crucifix and the word altar, being used several times.
Mm-hmm.
And altars were often places of sacrifice, as well as places where objects of veneration could be placed. So there is this theme of sacrifice.
It's like an implication that something might need to be sacrificed.
Yes. And again, this is all just our speculation, but perhaps there is an excessive spiritualization, an airiness that might have to be sacrificed in order for the weightiness, the counterweight, to be fully land, which could be used to open a door that could not be opened otherwise in the psyche.
Yeah, I think that's it.
I think so too.
Thank you to the dreamer for sharing this, and we're thinking about you.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.